Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm excited to be your guide in this AZ500 Microsoft Azure Security Technologies. We're in the second learning path for secure networking, and specifically the second module where we plan and implement security for private access to Azure resources. Let's get into this. When we take a look at private resources, this is internal to Azure. We've already talked in a previous recording about how to provide communications using VNets and subnets. We talked about VNet peering and the private backbone. That's communications. But we're now going to start taking a look at being able to access services. And so first and foremost, there's this thing called a service endpoint. So inside of Azure, we've got a whole bunch of services like Azure Storage. We've got Azure App Service Plans. We've got all these different services. We've got Azure SQL. And so we can actually create a communication between a subnet that we have and that service. So, and it's going to give you access to the global service. And I'm going to use the example of actually a storage account. So you'll learn in another recording that a storage account is a regionally based unit of replication and storage. So maybe in US West or Japan East or whatever region you've deployed a storage account, we've got them all around the world in every one of our Azure regions. I could gain access to Azure Storage and any of the storage accounts that my organization has configured that I have access to. So I can gain access to the service endpoint. I'll do an example of this in a bit. And what I can now do, instead of accessing the service, I then create a virtual IP address, and you'll see that in that light blue box in the center of the screen. It takes the service and it gives it a virtual IP address on the subnet that you want the other resources. So in my case, maybe I have some virtual machines that need to access some images that are in a storage account. So those VMs that are on that subnet could come to this IP address. In this case, it's 10.1.4, and it could then gain access to the storage account and the resources in that storage account that are in the Azure Storage service. Now, that's going to give me access to all the Azure storage accounts that I might have access to. Maybe that's too much. And from a security perspective, if I want to access multiple storage accounts, maybe that's the best way to do it. But if you want to access a very specific storage account, we're going to show you how to create a thing in a minute called a private endpoint that creates a one-to-one relationship. It's not just the entire service, it's a specific instance of a storage, in this case, the storage account itself. So I'll get more into that in just a few minutes. And I'll draw the diagram again, as I've done in other recordings, that will hopefully describe this to you. Now, why I want to mention this is, remember, we've talked about in other recordings about the NSGs, or the network security groups, that apply at the subnet level inside of your VNet. So if you wanted to secure communications into that subnet, I can now, instead of having to get out to, say an entire storage account and its URL and HTTP access that you wanted to communicate with, I can now project that through an IP address within that subnet, allowing for what appears to be communications on the same subnet. So from a security perspective, much more efficient than trying to access the service through Azure itself. Now, the other one that I've mentioned was this private endpoint. And so very similar to what we had before is the ability to now take a specific endpoint, in this case, not Azure Storage, but a storage account specifically, and create that storage account and project its IP address as an IP address within some other subnet. So both of those are available to you. From a security perspective, what is it that you want to narrow this down with? And so I'll draw this out in just a second as we take a look at it, all of the options that we have available to you. Now, so we have a service account, we have a private endpoint, and then what we have is this thing called a private link service. And this is a way for you to be able to then go through, and instead of creating that one-to-one relationship between a private endpoint and a specific instance of an Azure service, I can now create a private link service that is going to communicate with several pre-configured endpoints that you're working within a variety of Azure services. So for example, if you wanted to have a storage account and a SQL Service account accessed through that endpoint, you could have a private link service that configures this. And so this is just going to show you the configurations, and pay particular attention to all the components that are going to be in there in which you can apply security to make sure that that secure environment is available to you. So I just want to do a quick whiteboarding session. I'm going to go out and show you how you can set some of this stuff up, and I'll go back to that storage account example that I have as a demonstration for you within the portal. So let's take a look at how this plays out, and we'll try and hopefully give you a picture, and then I'll go into the portal and show you where this is configured and the security pieces that you can apply to it. So the first basic component is we've got our VNet. In this case, we might have 10.1.0.0/16. I might have multiple subnets in here. And I can have 10.1.1.0/24, 10.1.2.0/24, 10.1.3.0/24. I've got, in this subnet, I've got a series of resources, could be virtual machines, 10.1.2.50. I got another virtual machine, 10.1.2.100. They need to gain access to some file someplace in a storage account. That storage account might be in, let's say, West US 2, which is one of our regions. Now, the storage service is global in scope. In fact, you might actually have storage accounts. Let's mark it as SA. So you might have a storage account that has resources in it. This one might be in Germany. You might have another storage account that's in Asia. So if you create a connection to the service, this is done at the VNet level. I can assign it to a specific subnet in the VNet, or I can apply it to all of the subnets in the VNet. And it's going to give access to that storage from that subnet. Now, while you might specifically map to this specific storage account and that specific resource, theoretically, if there's any compromise or a security breach, you now actually have access potentially to all of storage and the storage accounts that you would have permissions to. So that becomes potentially a security issue. The other thing that we can do is we can create that private endpoint. Which takes a specific storage account and projects that storage account as if it were an IP address, in this case 10.1.2.45, whatever the number might be, so that now these devices look like they access it locally. So those are the differences between a private endpoint and a service endpoint. So let's go see how that plays out in the portal. Now, they're done from slightly different places. I showed you that from a VNet, you could come into and you can see the address range that we've mentioned already in other recordings. We can take a look at the subnets that we have in here, but I want to scroll down to the feature for a service endpoint. Now, I've already got it configured for several of these, and I can add, and here's the full list of services in Azure currently that's available that I could add as a service connection point to this virtual network. You just simply select it. You then tell it which policy you want to have to monitor it, and then which subnet or subnets that you want to associate it with. I've only got one in here, but it would, multiples you would be listed. So that's the service endpoint. Now, you do the private endpoint from a different point. You're going to go, in this case, I'm going to go to the storage account. And in this storage account, I've got multiple containers. This is where I'm going to be able to create blob storage. I got file shares. All these are going to be covered in other recordings. And so now for this storage account and all of the different types of storage that I can have in here, I'm going to come down into my networking feature. And this is where I'm going to be able to manage several components. Not part of this part of the recording, but I could have firewalls that I could put around and secure without implementing an Azure firewall. I could implement firewalls at the storage account to do packet filtering, SSL offloading, all the things that we talk about for firewalls. And virtual networks, do I want it to be available from only specific networks or all networks? And so partly from a security perspective, done in the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, monitored through Windows Defender for Cloud, this is one of the things that you may want to monitor and configure globally for your environment. So in here, I'm going to be able to create a private endpoint. Now, what I should do is, before I go through all the steps, is actually show you that there was nothing there. But I'm going to actually say, what do I want to create? It's a resource group. What is the name? I'll call it AZ500 Demo. Remember, it was going to create a network card. So what is the network card interface? What is the region that I want this to be deployed to? Any resources? So I can restrict it down to any one of the specific types of resources. I'm going to go to blob storage. What virtual network do I want it to go to? In this case, that VM1, the subnet that I want to connect it to. If I have any DNS configurations. But what it's now doing is it's going to create that network card into that VNet and that subnet so that I can now access the resource specifically through the network card. Okay, so we saw from the demo that the difference between a service account and a private endpoint are different ways to protect it where you create it, and we have different configurations that we can now monitor through Windows Defender for Cloud to see if the configuration's right, check for security configurations to meet the global standards that you've maybe deployed to make sure that you're not oversharing or over-accessing the resources. Another service you want to take a look at from internal to Azure is in traditional environments, you've built virtual machines on premises and you've put your applications onto those virtual machines. One of the features you want to take a look at, and one that we often talk to customers about, is why do you want to have, say, a Windows server? You know, it's great for us, or a Linux server that you then have to build, patch, you have to maintain the security of that server. You have to upgrade those servers, all the stuff that goes along with the server management. That really has nothing to do with your application other than it's the place in which you store the application or host the application. App services and app service plans are ways to take that infrastructure, that traditional virtual machines that you've built, and it obfuscates it and it puts it at the management of Microsoft. And so what you have now is you have this thing called an app service that gives you access to that infrastructure, but you're only having to manage your app service and not have to manage and patch the underlying infrastructure itself. And so by taking that app service plan and deploying it to a virtual network, it's the same as if you were to build a virtual machine on that network and put your application on that virtual machine without all the security and administration and cost of managing the infrastructure itself. So being able to work with the app service plan and from a security perspective, all of those things that you would expect to have, you can then still manage that through the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark and Windows Defender for Cloud, deploy the configurations, and manage and monitor these app services just like you would if you were deploying them to the infrastructure itself. Now, a version of the app service plan, I mentioned that what we've done is we've taken those virtual machines, Windows or Linux boxes, and moved them to the infrastructure of Azure that you then don't have to manage. But we might be putting other people's app service plans on the same physical servers that are running the virtual machines that your app is running on. Well, you might say, gosh, that doesn't work for me. I need to be able to make sure that my app runs in a secure environment, that it's not shared with anybody else. And it's great that you provide the security and the segmentation. So we have an app service environment that you can now create that provides both dedicated hardware and networking components so that you and you alone have those configurations. Now, you'll take a look at some of the features, that are available to you. NSGs are still there, limited public network exposure. There's lots of great features for that isolation, but there's always some kind of cost that goes along with this. And so you have to be worried about, the load that's being put on the app service environment that you've created to run one app. Are you going to totally utilize all that infrastructure? So make sure that you've done a mapping perspective, not really part of a security concern if you don't worry about that, but it absolutely is, a way to isolate at the physical infrastructure level of Azure to make sure that your application is nowhere near any other types of applications running on the infrastructure that the app service plan would run on. Similar to other services like we talked about, SQL offers this, and we'll be covering this in another recording. When you take SQL, there is a SQL server that runs on top of a Windows server. So now you've got a Windows server that you have to manage. You have to protect that. You have to patch it. You have to lock it down. And then you have to put SQL on top of that. Much like we did with the app service plans, Microsoft provides a whole series of SQL managed instances. And so you can get everything from a single database running on SQL Server. You can get a single instance of a SQL Server. You can get a SQL database that you're working with. So there's different configurations that you have available as an offering. Now, there are management tools, just like you would manage the SQL Server for inbound, outbound traffic. As I said in another recording, we're going to take a look at how do I protect the data on the SQL Server to, take a look at maybe masking or blocking access to private information, things like national identity numbers, credit card information. We have controls that we'll be covering in another recording, but, you can implement all of the same security configuration requirements that you would have done to a SQL Server that you managed, and you can now apply these to the SQL servers as managed instances. You can see you can have public endpoints to access that. You can make them privately available. And just like we showed you as a service, you can make that available as a private endpoint service, or you can open up to a SQL service as a service endpoint. So we've now seen ways to gain access to a series of Azure resources from Azure itself. And remember, if you wanted to gain access to these resources from an on-premises environment, what I would do is create a VNet inside of Azure. I would then create a subnet in that VNet with a VPN gateway that allows you to, from your on-premises world, to gain access to that VPN environment. So you're now at the VPN gateway, hopefully in a hub and spoke configuration. And now you use either directly in that hub network, probably wouldn't do that. You might have another VNet that you have VNet peering communication that you put the private endpoint of the SQL Server in there. So this can be, while we talk it's Azure to Azure to secure that communication, you can still make that publicly available using the VPN technologies that was done in another recording. So with that, thank you very much. This recording's over, and I look forward to seeing you at another recording.